Welcome to another episode of Professional Spotlight. I'm Pallavi Sharma, Director of PR and Social Media at Girls in Tech Minneapolis. And our guest for today's discussion is Alison Link. Currently, she's working as an academic technologist at University of Minnesota. And she's also working as a events coordinator on the Girls in Tech Minneapolis team. Alison, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks
so
for having
great to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat.
Awesome. Tell us a little about what does an academic technologist do, and how did you get interested in this position to begin with?
How did I even land where I am today?
Yeah.
So, it's interesting. So, in undergrad, I studied international relations, and I think I did that mainly. I went into undergrad with a couple goals. I knew I wanted to study abroad. I knew I wanted to devote a lot of time to learning languages. So, a lot of my early professional background was in foreign language teaching. And then I think through that, after undergrad, I spent some time in Austria, did a Fulbright program there and taught English for a while, and just had a lot of fun learning foreign languages. And in undergrad, I actually took one computer science course in my senior year, which was probably too late. I think that is a regret that I have. I wish I had taken a computer science course much earlier in my undergraduate career.
Yeah.
But then after some time in Austria, so I guess most of my early professional work had me on this track for language teaching, education, a lot of that. And then I landed back at the University of Minnesota and did a master's there in multicultural college teaching and learning, so sort of related to that concept of education, teaching, thinking about cultures and identities and sort of what it means to have access to education.
Right.
And there is where I also started working when as a grad assistant doing academic technology support too for a department. So that was a really interesting transition for me from education to technology and education. So it's always been contextualized for me, technology. Right. But I think very quickly working with users of technology, and users in our case are instructors and teachers and educators, or at least in my case, really get excited to also shape the technologies. So rather than just sort of being subject to the weird constraints or just different issues you confront in using technology, I wanted to think about how to shape them and work with them. So it's sort of, I like to play that kind of translational role from user needs into how do we ask for more things of the technologies we use, especially for teaching.
So you took one class in computer science, and how did you even get into thinking about, from perspective of getting into technology and furthering your career in that field?
And I think it's interesting because for me, technology and coding has always felt really related to my early interest in language. I haven't seen it as being very distinct, although I think
that is so cool.
Yeah. I think when my sister and my parents kind of thought, well, how did you get from here? And now you're doing academic technology and you're into French and German, and I've taken some Turkish. And I think the things that I loved about language, so I love the expressive capacity of language, but I also really love language and grammar and deconstructing grammar and what grammar lets you express or how it constrains you. And I in 7th grade, I confess I had a German grammar book on my bedside table, and I just love thinking about how things were constructed like that. So that sensibility, I think, translates really well into coding in the ways that coding lets you be expressive, but it poses certain creative constraints that lets you craft something. So it feels so related in my mind, but yeah, it's not an obvious leap, I guess, if it's
right off the bat. Looking at your background in international relations and multicultural college teaching and learning, it's not very. It doesn't seem like it's almost intuitive, but that's the way you've come together and you've gone into those, taken up positions which will lend itself to that.
It's all related to the same kind of fundamental things I get curious about too. And I guess I should say, coding is not my full-time day job. So I think a lot of what I feel like I do day to day is translating felt needs and things that people want to do into things that can become code.
Okay.
But it's not, I'm not as kind of architectural back-end things.
Sure.
I think the reasons I'm interested in coding, and to the extent that I work on sort of projects for myself for fun and, kind of take a weekend and sort of hack at something, it's for me to understand the possibilities so that I can sort of champion what seems possible or what could be possible for people who want to use technologies in new ways.
Okay, so could you do a little deep dive on some of the projects you're currently working?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think. I mean, maybe even just personally kind of things I have fun with.
Right.
I guess professionally it's also interesting too, but I've really loved just diving in, and I think I started personally learning coding through web coding. I think it's really easy to start just making yourself a personal website. So that was one of the first things I did, was just learning basic web structure. And then kind of from there you can move on into content management systems, and that's, you know, so WordPress is another step up from that, and that's a fun, I have now since in graduate school or postgraduate school taken a Rails course, so that's I guess a second official computer science course, and spend a lot of time, you know, I have a code school account and I do spend some time kind of self-teaching there. And also I love the meetup community in the communities, I guess, in the Twin Cities that are just really focused on giving you a space to learn and ask questions. And I really hope those feel like welcoming spaces to people, and that's kind of just a big, the thing I think I love about the coding community, again, like in and out of my day job, is I've loved finding hacking spaces, coding spaces, self-teaching spaces that feel sometimes closer to the most genuine form of learning and education that we've almost forgotten in a lot of our systems and schools. You know, higher ed is a system that may or may not always, you know,
work for everybody,
work towards the purpose of education, and K-12 is a system. And I think when I go to coding communities, that's a different sort of purity around how people are learning and teaching themselves.
Correct. Yes.
And holds us differently. I mean, it holds me differently accountable to thinking about bringing that into systems I work in education too.
Correct. And people in those communities come from a place of I want to learn more and I need help versus I know this. You know, like a lot of academic systems, there's always a structure to it. But with communities, like you said, you have people from all different backgrounds coming in to give you help and also ask for help. So
and if you come wanting to learn, I think you'll get a lot, and you have to take a lot of autonomy over your own learning in coding.
Right.
You know, you're kind of the only person you're accountable to. Part of that is because coding isn't my full-time day job, so I am really self-accountable to that. But I do think a lot of coders are attracted to that because they have a different self-determination around it than you normally would have. So.
Okay. Well, coming back to the Twin Cities area, having worked in the academia and with your experience being in the academia, what are some of the challenges you're seeing in promoting women in the technology field in schools and colleges?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, you know, one thing that I grapple with is we've just talked a little bit about you know, kind of coding, open hacking spaces. I felt relatively comfortable in those places, but I do need to kind of take a step back and think about what it's taken me to feel like I can take charge of those spaces and use them as good learning places. And I think there are sort of hacking spaces that women maybe don't know the cultural norms around or how to even start the approach. You know? So one of the things I did, I just went and had kind of all bets off. I don't need to know anything, and just ask questions. And I do think sometimes women are also differently empowered in those spaces to be able to ask questions. You know, you can kind of throw down the towel and say, there's no reason I need to know this. I want to learn it, and that's your biggest, you know, clout that you have in those spaces.
Right.
But I do think that it can feel harder to help women frame those as a place and have good conversations about what it takes to make that feel welcoming, and just the ways of making that those good social spaces for women to learn and take charge. So I think there's been a lot of good, you know, I do think there are some spaces for women to support each other, you know, in kind of women-only spaces. We've been working a little in the data community and kind of finding women, and there's a lot of actually coding that goes along with thinking about data as well. So I love like the R language is a lot of fun to play with. And, you know, I think in those communities there's some good space for kind of women to support each other and different learning styles there too. So I'm kind of open to both ideas, you know, women-only spaces and conversations, and creating styles of interaction that are differently collaborative. but I also do really, really, really value this kind of casual, self-made, help each other, and kind of it's a different meritocracy. It's not as hierarchical, these spaces and hacking spaces, and I want women to realize that those are spaces too that you can make welcoming for yourself, and let's have conversations about how to make those feel welcoming, that you don't have to feel, don't question yourself and how much you belong there. You belong there, absolutely.
Right.
And to the extent that you're willing to ask questions, that's a huge service to spaces, just being open learners. And I think women can do that well.
Exactly. So from going back to like high schools even, I mean, going further back, I mean, not even colleges, what in the high schools realm, what are the things that they can change around?
I think there's a trend that I've noticed being a positive thing in the coding community, or in the coding pedagogy generally, that I think is positive for all, but maybe also particularly to girls and women. There's been some different curricular approaches to make coding a little less churn it and out spits a number.
Right.
When we learned scheme in undergrad. When you learn scheme, you can kind of iterate over a list and have your list kind of show you, it can look mathy. And one thing my undergraduate institution did right before I actually took computer science that made a lot of sense to me is to show you these concepts, they interacted with a graphical interface. They used the GIMP and had our scheme, when we were coding in scheme, had it talk to GIMP, and GIMP would make just visual outputs for it. And that's showing coding is really related to patterns, and patterns are very related to art and nature. And so I think
putting that connection.
Putting coding in less of an abstract mathematical context and maybe an abstract visual, or just related to other patterns in life, artistic patterns. I think code and art have a lot to speak to each other with.
Right.
And I think that benefits everyone to have those married well, but it may also appeal to women and girls differently too. I would just hope generally folks in the world would. So I even noticed recently there's an edX course that's looking at processing and doing coding in a much more visual context. Think, Learn, Create, I think it was called, or something like that. And I've just noticed a lot of these different coding approaches are now not coding for numbers and input-output kind of in a numeric sense, but in a also more visual sense. So that might be more welcoming.
Correct. Are there any more like sort of IDEs that you can suggest, like that kids can use?
I really love, from a teaching perspective, Scheme is a really cool, not Scheme. Oh my gosh, the MIT project.
Yes, right.
Scratch, Scheme is more of a Lispy. That was my learning language, but Scratch.
Scratch is great.
Is wonderful, super fun because it makes the concepts, it pulls out the concepts of coding, and then it also, again, that's a huge visual emphasis, which I think just appeals to kids differently. It helps you start folks earlier, and I also am a huge fan of Raspberry Pis. I'm just a crazy nerd for Raspberry Pis. I don't want to confess how many I have at home. Just got a new Raspberry Pi 2. But that, I think one of the bigger things that's also related to coding that I noticed that kids are really good at understanding is getting over this fear of breaking things is one of the first things that most people who get into tech learn quickly. And actually, maybe I should take a step back too and talk about kind of one other way that I learned coding or kind of approached coding is while I was living in Austria, participated in a women-oriented kind of intro coding 2-week-long sort of modular course. And it was from the University of Salzburg there. And they did a really good job saying, we're going to create a different kind of community for women specifically. And they did sort of walk us through a lot of these different processes of, we're going to take apart a computer. You will feel like you're breaking it. You're not, and we'll, reinstall an operating system and you'll see that it will work. And they did a really great job of creating community around it, and then also kind of going through the motions of, I think, things that a lot of boys and men maybe sometimes have more occasion to encounter. They did that for us together, and we could walk through that together. So
very cool.
Yeah.
So going, like, if you had to give a career advice to these young women who are thinking or at that edge of making that decision to go get into technology or take a different path, what is it that you would advise them?
Yeah, well, there's one thing I was thinking about earlier that I think relates to this too is, and this might appeal, I think this is advice that applies to anyone, but maybe especially girls and women thinking about, is don't think about coding as an, either or.
Yeah.
I think a coding and, so we have conversations at the university too about, you can do, I remember hearing about our art degree, they think of art sometimes as art and, or, so I could even think coding and art, or, music and coding, or, so think about it as, I think if you have, I would say this for anyone thinking about how to balance their education and making choices about their education generally. Don't think you need to make one choice when you can choose,
Right.
I think journalism talks about that too, being a journalist without a context, you don't get as far. A journalist who studies history has just a lot of different things to grab onto. So I think the same applies for coding. Learn coding and learn other things you're interested in, and you'll have a sense of purpose and a sense of why you're building things, and also a sense of how.
Right.
I think we'll benefit from that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Alison.
Yeah.
It was great talking to you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us for another episode of Professional Spotlight. Please don't forget to visit our website at www.GiTMSP.org, and don't forget to subscribe to our e-newsletter. Special thanks to University of St. Thomas for providing us the space. Thank you.